The photograph sat on the mantel like a question that had waited 42 years for an answer. Three figures stood before a rough-hewn cabin, mountains rising behind them like cathedral spires reaching toward heaven. The man in the center, tall and broad-shouldered, wore buckskin and had a scar that ran from his forehead to his left cheek. On either side of him stood two women identical in every way, their honey blonde hair catching the sunlight, their faces turned not toward the camera, but toward him. Samuel Hayes stood before that photograph on Christmas Eve, 1918, his army uniform pressed and ready for the morning train that would carry him to France, in a war that had already devoured a generation of young men. He had looked at this image 1,000 times growing up, but tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like a door about to open. "You asked me once why I never remarried after your Grandma Anna died." Samuel turned to find his grandfather in the doorway. Elijah Stone, at 70, still carried the mountains in his frame, though his hair had gone white as winter and the years had carved deep lines around his eyes. The scar that marked his face seemed darker in the firelight, a reminder of some long-ago violence. "I remember," Samuel said. "You told me the story wasn't simple." It wasn't. Elijah moved to his chair by the fire, each step deliberate, the gait of a man who had spent a lifetime reading trails and walking softly. "But you're shipping out tomorrow. You might not come back. And before you go, you need to know what you're fighting for. What's worth surviving for." Samuel settled onto the floor at his grandfather's feet the way he had as a boy, listening to tales of beaver traps and grizzly bears. But the old man's face held something different now. Not the weather-beaten calm of a storyteller, but the raw vulnerability of confession. "That photograph," Elijah said, his voice carrying the weight of 4 decades, "shows the 3 most important people in my life. Your father Thomas's mother, Rebecca, on my left, and Ruth, your Aunt Anna's mother, on my right. I know Grandpa. They were best friends who both married you after Grandma Anna passed." "No." The word hung in the air like smoke. "That's the story we told people because it was easier. The truth is, I didn't marry them one after the other. I married them both, the same day. And they weren't just friends, Samuel. They were sisters, twins, Rebecca and Ruth Winters. And they weren't supposed to love me at all because, when I met them, they were brides of Christ." The fire crackled. Outside, snow fell soft and silent over the Wind River Valley. "So what I'm about to tell you, your father doesn't know the whole truth of. But before you go off to face death in those trenches, you need to understand that love, real love, is the only thing that makes any of this bearable. And sometimes that love comes in ways the world says are wrong, but God knows are right." Elijah closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were seeing not the warm cabin of 1918, but a frozen mountain wilderness 42 years distant. It started with a storm. November 1876. The Wind River Range rose sharp and unforgiving against the sky the color of old iron. Elijah Stone, 28 years old and already half ghost, worked his trap line with the methodical precision of a man who had forgotten why he was alive, but remembered how to stay that way. The cabin he called home sat in a clearing where 3 valleys met, positioned so the morning sun could reach it and the prevailing winds would carry smoke away from the door. He had built it himself after Anna died. When the grief became so heavy, he had to move away from anything that remembered her. Every log had been cut, shaped, and fitted by hands that needed to stay busy or risk picking up the rifle and ending what felt like an already finished story. This morning, those hands moved through familiar patterns. Check the trap line. 12 miles in a rough circle through country that could kill a man 6 different ways before breakfast. 3 beaver waited in the sets, their pelts thick with the approach of winter. 1 marten hung by its hind leg from a snare, the reddish fur catching what little light filtered through the gathering clouds. Elijah's knife work was surgical. The blade honed to an edge that could split a hair-parted hide from flesh with the kind of precision that spoke to years of practice and an attention to detail that bordered on reverence. Each pelt represented weeks of survival trade goods that would keep him in powder and flour through the long winter. But more than that, the work kept his hands occupied and his mind from wandering to the trunk in the corner of his cabin that still held Anna's things. Back at the cabin, he stretched the beaver pelts on willow frames he had carved the previous spring. The tension had to be perfect. Too loose and the hide would shrink unevenly. Too tight and it would tear at the edges, ruining weeks of work. His fingers, scarred and calloused from a lifetime of mountain work, knew the exact pressure needed. They remembered what his heart tried to forget, that precision and care could sometimes save a life, but not always. Not when it mattered most. The first sign of the storm came not from the sky, but from the animals. The chickadees that usually flitted through the pines near his cabin had gathered in nervous flocks, their chatter urgent and chaotic. Elk were moving down from the high country, and it was too early in the season for that kind of migration. Elijah stepped outside and read the clouds with eyes that had learned weather the way other men learn scripture. Mare's tails streaked across the northern sky, delicate as lace, and just as deceptive. Beneath them, mammatus clouds bulged like bruises, their undersides the color of old pewter. The wind had shifted from west to northeast, carrying with it the smell of snow and something else. Something that made the scar tissue along his ribs ache, where the grizzly had opened him up 2 years back. Big storm coming? Historic maybe. The kind that killed the unprepared and humbled the ready. Elijah had 36 hours, perhaps less. He worked with the kind of focused intensity that was as close to prayer as he got anymore. 3 cords of split wood went under the lean-to, protected from the wet. Water barrels filled from the creek before ice could lock it down. The horses, 2 sturdy mountain-bred animals that had cost him a year's worth of pelts, went into the reinforced shelter he had built against the north side of the cabin. He checked the chimney for creosote buildup, knowing that a chimney fire during a blizzard could end him as surely as freezing. Inside, he inventoried supplies with the same care. Flour, salt, dried meat, coffee. Enough for 3 weeks if he was careful, a month if he was desperate. The medical kit his late wife's father had given him sat in its leather case, the instruments clean and oiled. Dr. Morrison had taught him field surgery during the years Elijah had courted Anna, never imagining that those skills would be needed for anything more than setting a broken leg or stitching a trapping accident. Certainly never imagining that Elijah would use everything the old doctor had taught him and still lose both daughter and granddaughter to a childbirth that went wrong in ways no amount of skill could fix. Dr. Morrison had died 6 months before Anna spared the knowledge that his teachings couldn't save his own child. Elijah picked up the straight razor from his shaving kit and held it to the lamplight, checking the edge. Sharpening things had become a compulsion in the 14 months since he had buried his wife and infant daughter. Knives, axes, saws, razors. If it had an edge, he honed it. The repetitive motion, the focus required, the measurable improvement from dull to sharp, was the only meditation that quieted the voice in his head that said he should have been faster, smarter, better. The voice that said a good man would have saved them. He set the razor down and forced himself to inventory the bookshelf Dr. Morrison had also given him. Medical texts sat beside Shakespeare, Plutarch, next to a farmer's almanac. The Bible, leather-bound and inscribed with Anna's maiden name, gathered dust. Elijah hadn't opened it since the funeral. He figured God, and he had come to an understanding Elijah would stay out of God's way, and God would stop taking the people Elijah loved. So far, the arrangement had worked mostly because Elijah didn't love anyone anymore. That night alone in the cabin, that was too big for one person and too small for the grief it contained, he sat by the fire and sharpened knives. Outside, the wind began to howl. The storm hit at noon the next day like a fist through a window. One moment the world was gray and waiting. The next it disappeared into a wall of white that turned visibility to arm's length and sound into a roar that made thought impossible. The temperature, already brutal, plummeted until the cold became a physical presence that found every gap in clothing, every crack in walls, every weakness in resolve. Elijah sat in his cabin and listened to the wind try to peel the roof off. He had done everything that could be done. Now came the waiting, and with waiting came memory. And with memory came Anna's face as the light left her eyes, her hand going slack in his, her last breath asking him to save their daughter, and his own hands skilled and steady, unable to stop the bleeding that came from somewhere deep inside where no knife could reach. The sound cut through the wind and the memory both. At first he thought it was the mountain lion that sometimes prowled the high country. They could sound eerily human when the mood took them, their screams like a woman in distress. But this was different. It came in a pattern. 3 cries, a pause, 3 more. Too regular for an animal, too desperate for anything but genuine terror. Elijah stood and moved to the door. Opening it required his full strength against the wind. Snow drove into his face like thrown sand, each flake sharp enough to draw blood. The sound came again, faint beneath the storm's fury from the direction of the ravine 200 yards north. Every instinct told him to close the door. The last time he had left during a crisis to help someone else, he had come home to find Anna dying. If he had stayed instead of riding to the neighbor's place to help with a difficult calving, maybe he would have noticed the signs earlier. Maybe he could have gotten her to a doctor in time. Maybe their daughter would have taken her first breath instead of being born silent in blue. But Anna's voice, clear as if she stood beside him, spoke in his memory, "Don't leave people to suffer, Eli. That's not who you are." He roped himself to the cabin's main post with 50 feet of hemp, grabbed the emergency pack he kept ready, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and stepped into the maelstrom. The world became an assault, wind strong enough to stagger him, cold that bit through layers of wool and buckskin to freeze the breath in his lungs, snow so thick he could barely see the rope that connected him to safety. He followed the sound one careful step at a time, testing each footfall before committing his weight. The wagon had gone over the edge of the ravine, probably trying to find shelter and misjudging the ground in the whiteout. It lay on its side, half buried already, the horses gone or dead. Beneath it, trapped in a space too small and getting smaller as the snow accumulated, were two figures in black. Even through the storm, even with his eyes streaming from the cold, Elijah could see they were women. The religious habits they wore stood out stark against the snow-black cloth already crusted white. One was conscious, trying with frozen hands to dig her companion free. The other lay still, blood darkening the snow around her head. The conscious one saw him, and her eyes widened, not with relief, but with something closer to resignation. "Go," she shouted over the wind, her voice hoarse and breaking. "Leave us. God's will." Elijah didn't answer. Answering wasted air and energy. He assessed the situation with the cold calculation of a man who had dealt with mountain emergencies before. The wagon weighed at least 800 pounds. Both women were pinned beneath the tongue assembly, wedged into a space that was part ravine wall, part snow, part overturned wood. Moving the wagon wrong would crush them further. The unconscious one's positioning suggested possible spinal injury. The conscious one's right leg twisted at an angle that spoke to broken bones. Temperature was still dropping. Wind chill had to be pushing 40 below. They had maybe 15 minutes before hypothermia made rescue irrelevant. Elijah's mind, the same mind that had tried for 14 months to shut down entirely, came alive with the kind of clarity that only absolute necessity could bring. He unslung his rifle and used it as a first-class lever, wedging the barrel under the wagon's edge and using a snow-covered boulder as a fulcrum. The mechanical advantage was roughly 6-to-1 enough to lift the corner a few inches. The wood creaked. Snow shifted. The conscious woman's eyes tracked his every movement, and even through her pain, Elijah could see her mind working, understanding what he was doing, recognizing competence when she saw it. He jammed a split section of wagon debris into the gap he'd created, then repositioned for the next lift. This time he used an aspen pole he tore from the wagon's broken frame. Longer lever, better angle. The wagon rose another 6 inches. Enough. He pulled the unconscious one free, first moving her with the care Dr. Morrison had drilled into him, stabilized the neck support. The spine assumed the worst and planned accordingly. The head wound was obvious, a 3-inch gash that had bled freely into the snow. Her skin was the color of old candles, her breathing shallow enough to be almost invisible. The conscious one tried to move on her own and her leg buckled. She bit back a scream that would have been lost in the wind anyway. Elijah looked at her, then at the rope connecting him to his cabin, then back at her. 2 trips, had to be. Carrying dead weight through a blizzard would take everything he had. Making the journey twice might kill him. He thought of Anna asking him to save their daughter. Thought of his hands slick with blood, trying to do what no hands could do. Then he stopped thinking and started moving. The first trip carrying the unconscious woman in his arms nearly ended both of them. She was heavier than she looked, all lean muscle beneath the sodden religious habit. The rope guided him through zero visibility, but twice he went down to one knee when the wind hit a gust that staggered him. Each time he forced himself up, adjusted his grip, and kept walking. Inside the cabin, he laid her on the floor near the fire, but not too close. Too much heat, too fast, could send her system into shock. He wrapped her in dry blankets, positioned warm water bottles at her core points, and checked her breathing. Still shallow but steady. No time to do more. The other one was still out there. The second trip was somehow harder. The conscious woman had tried to follow him, crawling through the snow on her hands and one good leg. She had made it perhaps 30 feet before the cold and pain had stopped her. When Elijah found her, she was curled into a ball, shaking so hard her teeth rattled. He picked her up without asking permission. She was too cold to protest. Her arms came around his neck more from instinct than awareness, and he could feel the violent shivers running through her body. Hypothermia advanced stage. Another 10 minutes and she would have started feeling warm, the sign that the body was giving up its fight. This time when he stumbled, she held on tighter. Her face pressed into his neck, and through the layers of cold and fear and pain, he felt her breath against his skin. Alive. Still alive. The cabin door had never looked so good. He kicked it shut behind him, and the sudden absence of wind made his ears ring. Two women, both hypothermic, one with a head injury, one with a probable fracture. Elijah's hands were shaking from cold and exertion, but his mind clicked through the protocols Dr. Morrison had taught him. Dry clothes first. Modesty could wait until they weren't dying. He stripped them both with clinical efficiency, his eyes seeing not women but patients. The habits came off to reveal simple cotton undergarments soaked through and frozen in places. Those came off too. He wrapped them in every dry blanket he owned, positioned them both near the fire, got water heating for warm compresses. Only then did he let himself notice the details. They were young, maybe early 20s. Tall for women, perhaps 5'8", with builds that spoke to good health before the storm had nearly killed them. And they were identical, not just similar, but mirror images, the kind of twins that made a person look twice to be sure they were seeing straight. The unconscious one had the head wound. Elijah cleaned it with boiled water and whiskey, his hands steady despite the fatigue that was starting to make his vision swim. The gash went deep, exposing skull in one place. It needed stitching. He had thread boiled and ready, a curved needle from his medical kit, and 14 months of practice, keeping his hands steady even when his heart wanted to stop. The stitches went in and clean, and even each one a small act of defiance against death. 14 in total. He packed the wound with honey and crushed garlic, covered it with clean cloth, and moved to the next problem. The conscious one's leg. She was awake now, watching him work on her sister, with eyes that were surprisingly clear despite the trauma. When he moved to examine her leg, she didn't flinch, just gritted her teeth and let him work. Not broken, thank God. Badly bruised, possibly a hairline fracture, but nothing that wouldn't heal given time and rest. He splinted it anyway, using carved pine and deer hide, binding it with leather strips that allowed for swelling. Through it all, neither woman spoke. The conscious one watched his hands with an intensity that made Elijah uncomfortable. She was seeing something in his movements, recognizing something in the care he took. He didn't want to be seen. Being seen meant being known, and being known meant the possibility of losing again. "You know medicine," she said finally, her voice rough from cold and screaming. "Where did you learn?" Elijah didn't look up from the splint he was tying. "Wife's father, doctor, taught me before she died." "I'm sorry." The words hit harder than the storm had. He stood abruptly, moving to check on the unconscious twin, anything to break the moment of connection. "Don't be," he said, his voice flat. "Kept her alive for 9 years. Couldn't save her when it mattered." He felt, rather than saw, the conscious woman's reaction. Felt the weight of her gaze shift from curiosity to understanding to something deeper. She was looking at him the way a person looked at their own reflection in dark water. By the time he finished with both of them, full night had fallen. The storm howled outside like something alive and angry. Inside the cabin glowed warm with firelight. 2 women lay wrapped in blankets on his floor. Elijah stood at his small window looking out at nothing, feeling the exhaustion of the rescue settling into his bones. "Why did you help us?" The conscious woman's voice came from behind him. "Because it was the right thing to do. Many wouldn't have. That's their failure, not mine." He turned to find her watching him again, her blue-gray eyes reflecting firelight. Something in her expression had changed. In the world she came from, in the religious life she had chosen, she was probably accustomed to seeing God's work in miracles and answered prayers. But there was something about competence, about skilled hands, and calm action in crisis that spoke to a different kind of faith. The faith that some people simply did the right thing because they were built that way. "Who are you?" she asked. "Elijah Stone." "I'm Rebecca Winters. My sister is Ruth. We're novices. We were traveling to a mission when the storm caught us." Novices, not full nuns yet. The name Winters registered somewhere in his mind. Elijah filed that information away without examining why it mattered. Your sister needs rest, he said instead. So do you. Storm's going to last 3 days. No one can travel. You're safe here. Rebecca nodded, but her eyes stayed on him a moment longer. Then she lay back, down her body, finally surrendering to exhaustion. Elijah took his own bedroll and settled into the corner, his rifle across his lap out of habit. Mountain men learned to sleep light or didn't live to get old. But tonight, sleep didn't come easy. He kept seeing Rebecca's eyes in the firelight, kept feeling the weight of Ruth's unconscious body in his arms, kept hearing Anna's voice telling him not to leave people to suffer. Somewhere in the small hours of the night, Ruth began to stir. The sound of movement brought Elijah fully awake. 42 years of mountain living had wired his nervous system to register any change in his environment. Ruth Winters was trying to sit up, her hands going to the bandage on her head, confusion written across her face. Rebecca. Her voice was thick with pain and disorientation. Rebecca. I'm here. Rebecca was already moving toward her sister, despite her splinted leg. I'm here. Elijah watched them lock eyes across the small space. No words passed between them, but entire conversations seemed to flow in that gaze. Questions asked and answered. Fears acknowledged and soothed. It was the kind of communication that came from a lifetime of being halves of the same whole. Ruth relaxed immediately, her panic subsiding the moment she confirmed her sister's presence. Only then did she seem to notice Elijah sitting in his corner with the rifle across his knees. He saved us, Rebecca said. Both of us. Ruth's eyes traveled over Elijah's face, lingering on the scar that marked him from forehead to cheek. Where Rebecca had looked at him with analytical assessment, Ruth's gaze held something different, something that made Elijah shift uncomfortably. It was as if she could see past the walls he had spent 14 months building, straight through to the wound that had never healed. You carry grief like a stone, Ruth whispered softly. Heavy and cold. You've lost someone precious. The words struck like an arrow, finding the gap in armor. Elijah froze his hand, tightening on the rifle. Nobody had mentioned Anna to him in 14 months. His neighbors had learned quickly that her name was not to be spoken, her memory not to be touched. Rest, he managed, his voice coming out rougher than intended. You hit your head hard. I see things sometimes. Ruth's eyes had taken on a distant quality, as if she were looking at something beyond the cabin walls. Dreams, visions. I saw this. Last week. In a dream. Rebecca's face creased with concern. Ruth, you're confused. I saw snow, a man with a scar, a cabin. Ruth's gaze came back to the present, fixed on Elijah with unsettling intensity. And I saw us happy. The word hung in the air like smoke. Elijah stood abruptly, moving to hang a kettle over the fire. His hands needed something to do something to stop them from shaking. Saw what? He asked without turning around. Ruth's answer came as a whisper. Everything we needed. Silence settled over the cabin, broken only by the wind's howl and the fire's crackle. Elijah didn't turn around. Couldn't. Because somewhere in the part of his heart he thought had died with Anna, something had stirred at Ruth's words. Something that felt dangerous and necessary all at once. Behind him he heard the soft sounds of the twins settling in for sleep. Rebecca helped Ruth lie back down, their whispered conversation too low for him to hear clearly. But he caught snatches. Ruth's voice asking if Rebecca felt it too. Rebecca's sharp response about propriety and vows. Ruth's gentle insistence that maybe this was why they had survived. Elijah forced himself to focus on the kettle. Water would boil or it wouldn't. That was simple, that he could control. Unlike whatever was happening in his chest every time he looked at the two women who had appeared out of the storm, the sleeping arrangements revealed more about all three of them than any conversation could have. Elijah insisted the twins take his bed. They refused on grounds of impropriety. The compromise saw them nested together in blankets by the fireplace, while Elijah took his corner, sitting with his back against the wall, rifle in reach. He told himself it was his usual sleeping position. Mountain men didn't trust comfort. Comfort got you killed. The truth, which he wouldn't admit even to himself, was that he couldn't bring himself to lie down fully. Lying down meant relaxing. Relaxing meant dropping his guard. And dropping his guard around these two women felt more dangerous than facing a grizzly unarmed. The fire burned low, painting the cabin in shades of amber and shadow. The twins lay face to face, their identical profiles mirror images in the firelight. For a long while, the only sounds were the storm outside and the occasional pop of settling wood. Then Ruth's whisper, so soft, Elijah almost convinced himself he imagined it. "Rebecca, did you feel it?" A pause. Then Rebecca's voice, equally quiet. "Feel what?" "When he carried you, when his hands were bandaging, did you feel?" "No." The response came too quickly to be true. "We're novices, Ruth, 18 days from final vows." "That's not an answer." Longer pause this time. Elijah stayed perfectly still, his breathing unchanged, giving no sign he could hear every word. "Mountain living taught you to listen. Pray move quietest before the strike. Weather changed with whispers before the roar. And secrets, real secrets, came out in darkness when people thought no one was listening." Yes, Rebecca's admission came like a confession. "I felt something." "So did I when he stitched in my head. His hands were so gentle, and I thought God's hands would feel like this." "Stop." Rebecca's voice carried urgency now. "We can't think like that." "Why not? We haven't taken final vows yet. We can still what fall for a mountain hermit who barely speaks, who lost his wife and hasn't recovered." Elijah's jaw clenched. Being discussed was bad enough. Being so accurately dissected was worse. "Maybe that's why we're here," Ruth continued. "Not for the mission, for him. That's blasphemy. Or it's providence." The conversation trailed off into silence. Elijah sat in his corner, every muscle tight, his mind racing despite his best efforts to shut it down. They were planning something. Women always plan something. Anna used to whisper to herself, like that, planning nursery colors and baby names in a future that would never come. He forced the memory away, forced his breathing to stay steady, forced himself to focus on the present, the storm, the women, the need to get them to their mission and out of his life before they could make him feel things he had sworn never to feel again. Alone was safe. Alone meant no one else died because of him. But even as he repeated that mantra, even as he stared at the far wall and willed himself to become stone, he couldn't stop his eyes from drifting to the two women by the fire. Couldn't stop noticing the way they held hands even in sleep, fingers intertwined like roots of the same tree. Couldn't stop remembering Ruth's words about seeing happiness in a vision. Couldn't stop the part of him that wondered if maybe, just maybe, God was trying to give him something instead of taking it away. The thought was so foreign, so dangerous that he pushed it down immediately. But it wouldn't stay buried. It kept rising like a body in dark water, demanding to be acknowledged. By the time gray light started seeping through the windows, Elijah hadn't slept at all. The storm still raged outside. Inside, two women breathed in perfect synchronization, alive, against all odds, warm and safe in his cabin. And in his chest, in the place he thought had frozen solid, something began the painful process of thawing. Morning brought no mercy. If anything, the storm had intensified. Snow fell so thick it seemed solid, less like weather, and more like the world ending one flake at a time. The wind shrieked across the peaks, and Elijah could feel the cabin shuddering under the assault. Ruth's fever started 2 hours after dawn. Elijah had been changing the dressing on her head wound when he noticed the heat radiating from her skin. He checked her forehead with the back of his hand, a gesture so automatic it brought memories of checking their daughter for illness of Anna's worried face in lamplight. The infection had set in despite his precautions. Scalp wounds were unpredictable that way. The proximity to the brain, the richness of blood supply, the difficulty in keeping them truly clean, all conspired to create the perfect environment for fever. "Damn," he muttered. Rebecca was alert immediately. "What's wrong?" "Infection, wounds contaminated despite cleaning. Happens with scalp wounds." "What needs to be done?" Elijah met her eyes, saw the fear there, tightly controlled but present. "Drain it. It'll hurt." Ruth, already feverish, managed a weak smile. "Do what you need to." What he needed to do was open a fresh wound, drain the infection, and hope the body's natural defenses could handle what remained. He heated his knife in the fire until the blade glowed dull red. Sterilization the old way, the way that worked when whiskey and boiled water weren't enough. "Bite down on this." He gave Ruth a strip of leather. She took it without protest. Rebecca moved without being asked, taking her sister's hand. Both women were crying before Elijah even touched the knife to skin, but neither made a sound. The surgery was brutal and necessary. Elijah reopened two of the stitches he had so carefully placed the night before. The pus that drained out was thick and yellow, the smell unmistakable. He flushed the wound with pure alcohol, and Ruth's scream into the leather was a sound Elijah knew he would hear in his nightmares. But he didn't stop, couldn't stop. His hands moved with the cold precision of a man who had learned that sentiment during surgery killed patients. He drained the infection, flushed again, packed the wound with fresh honey and a poultice made from bread mold, the closest thing to medicine he had for bacterial infection. Only when he was restitching the wound with fresh thread did he notice his hands were shaking. Rebecca noticed too. Her eyes tracked the tremor, seeing past the stoic expression to the man beneath, seeing that this wasn't easy for him, that every moment of causing pain cost him something. After a while, Ruth slipped into fever sleep. Rebecca helped Elijah clean the instruments. Her hands moved carefully despite the splint on her leg. They worked in silence, the kind that felt less like absence of words and more like a different form of communication. "You didn't have to help us," Rebecca said finally. "You could have left us in the storm." Elijah focused on cleaning the knife. "Wouldn't have been able to live with myself." "Why not?" "Because that's not who I choose to be." It was almost the same conversation they'd had the night before, but this time Rebecca heard something beneath the words. Heard the way he said choose like it was a daily battle he fought and won. Heard the code he lived by even when living hurt. "Who taught you that?" she asked. "Your wife." Elijah's hands went still on the knife. For a moment, Rebecca thought she'd gone too far, pushed into territory that was marked with warning signs for good reason. When he spoke, his voice was hard as granite. "Don't talk about her." "I'm sorry, I just meant, she taught me that caring leads to loss." He stood abruptly, the knife gripped tight in one hand. "You love someone, they die. That's what I learned." He walked to the door, threw it open into the blizzard, and stood there breathing the freezing air like a drowning man breaking surface. Behind him, Rebecca sat frozen, understanding, flooding through her with the force of revelation. This man wasn't just grieving, he was punishing himself, building walls not to keep others out, but to keep his own heart in locked away where it couldn't betray him again by caring. The door slammed shut. Through the window, Rebecca could barely make out Elijah's form standing in the storm, without coat or hat, letting the cold do what pain couldn't make him feel something other than loss. She looked down at her sister, fevered and vulnerable, and made a decision without fully understanding what it meant. Whatever God had planned for their lives, whatever vows they had almost taken, this moment felt more real than anything in the 10 years since their parents had died. This man, broken and refusing to heal, needed them. And maybe, just maybe, they needed him too. Night fell early, the way it did during storms when the sun couldn't fight through the cloud cover. Ruth's fever climbed higher. By midnight, she was delirious, calling for parents who had been dead a decade. "Mama," her voice came small and childlike. "Mama, I'm scared. The Indians are coming. Mama, where are you?" Rebecca held her sister's hand and wept. Elijah worked with the methodical intensity of a man who had done this before and failed and was determined not to fail again. Cool compresses changed every few minutes. Willow bark tea forced between Ruth's lips, the natural aspirin fighting the fever from within. Constant monitoring of her pulse racing at over 160, her heart trying to outrun the infection, burning through her body. "Don't you die," Rebecca whispered to her twin. "Don't you dare leave me." Elijah heard the words and felt them like a blade. That's what he had said to Anna. Begged her not to leave, promised her anything if she would just hold on. But death didn't bargain. Death just took what it wanted and left the living to figure out how to keep breathing. Ruth's eyes opened unfocused and seeing things that weren't there. "Rebecca, I don't want to take vows. I never wanted to. I didn't want to leave you." Rebecca's sob caught in her throat. "Ruth, rest. I'm not called to God. I'm called to you, always you. We can't be separated. That's why I said yes to convent, to stay together." The confession came pouring out in fever's truth, the kind of honesty that only approached death could bring. Rebecca bent over her sister, her tears falling on Ruth's face. "I know," Rebecca whispered. "I know I did the same thing." Elijah's hands paused in changing the compress. He looked up and found Rebecca's eyes on him, and in them he saw his own truth reflected back. Two people who had made choices out of fear, who had hidden from life because living meant risking loss. "The man," Ruth's fevered voice continued, The scarred man. He's going to save us. Not from the storm. From the bows we don't want. Elijah stood abruptly, moving to the far side of the cabin. He couldn't hear this. Couldn't let these women pin their hopes on him. He was the man who had failed his wife, his daughter, everyone who had ever needed him to be more than he was. But Ruth wasn't finished. Her eyes glassy with fever somehow found him across the room. He thinks he doesn't deserve to be happy, but he does. And we're going to show him. Both of us. Together. The words hung in the air like a prophecy. Elijah felt them settle into his chest, heavy and inevitable. He turned back to find both women watching him now. Ruth through fever's veil, Rebecca with clear, desperate hope. She doesn't know what she's saying, he managed. Yes, she does. Rebecca's voice was steady despite her tears. Ruth sees things, true things. She always has. The fever broke at dawn. One moment Ruth was burning her skin dry and hot as sun-baked stone. The next sweat poured from her in torrents, soaking through the blankets. Her breathing slowed. Her pulse, which had been racing toward catastrophe, settled into something closer to normal. Elijah changed the compresses one final time, his hands steady despite the exhaustion making his vision swim. When he checked her pupils, they were equal and reactive. When he felt her forehead, the killing heat had passed. She's through it, he said. Rebecca collapsed against her sister, holding her close, whispering thanks to a God Elijah wasn't sure was listening. He turned away, giving them privacy, and moved to the window. The storm was finally breaking. Not done, not by a long shot, but the worst had passed. Through gaps in the cloud cover, he could see patches of sky the color of old bruises. By tomorrow, maybe the day after, travel would be possible. He could get these women to their mission. Get them out of his life. Get back to the isolation that kept him safe. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it felt like losing something he hadn't known he wanted to keep. Behind him, Ruth stirred. Her voice came weak but lucid. Thank you. Elijah didn't turn around. Not done yet. Infection could come back. No, Ruth's hand found Rebecca's. Thank you for giving this time. Time for what? The twins looked at each other, another of their wordless conversations flowing between them. When Rebecca turned back to Elijah, her expression held the kind of determination that came from reaching a decision that terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. Time to figure out what we really want, she said. Before Elijah could respond, before he could build the walls back up and retreat into silence, a new sound cut through the dying wind. Hoofbeats, multiple horses moving fast despite the snow. Elijah grabbed his spyglass and moved to the window. 3 riders pushing through drifts that should have been impassable. They rode with purpose, following the trail the twins' wagon had left before the storm buried it. You expecting someone? He asked. Rebecca's face went pale. Sister Margaret. She was supposed to meet us at the mission outpost 3 days ago. Problem. The look Rebecca and Ruth exchanged told Elijah everything he needed to know before Rebecca spoke. She's the Mother Superior. Very strict. Very unforgiving. If she finds us here alone with you for 3 days, Rebecca's voice trailed off. She'll assume the worst, Ruth finished. Through the spyglass, Elijah watched the riders approach. The figure in the lead sat her horse like judgment, incarnate, her posture rigid even through the storm's aftermath. This was a woman who believed in rules, who saw the world in absolutes of right and wrong with no gray in between. Then we tell her the truth, Elijah said. You were dying, I saved you. End of story. Ruth's soft laugh held no humor. But it's not the end, is it? Elijah lowered the spyglass and looked at the 2 women who had appeared out of a storm to turn his carefully ordered isolation into chaos. Ruth still weak from her brush with death, but watching him with eyes that saw too much. Rebecca analytical and afraid, but holding her ground. No, he admitted. I don't think it is. The hoofbeats grew louder. Through the window, the riders crested the final rise. In minutes, they would be at the door. In minutes, whatever was building in this cabin would have to face the judgment of the outside world. Elijah picked up his rifle, not as a weapon, but as a talisman. Something solid and familiar to hold on to while everything else shifted like snow in a wind. Rebecca struggled to her feet despite her splinted leg. Ruth tried to rise and couldn't, still too weak. The twins reached for each other, instinctively, hands clasping tight. Outside, the horses came to a stop. Voices called out in words Elijah couldn't make out over the distance, but he could hear the tone. Authority, anger. accusation. He looked at Rebecca and Ruth one more time, saw the fear in their eyes, yes, but something else too. Something that looked like determination. Like two people who had spent their lives being told who they should be, finally deciding to become who they were. Whatever happens, Rebecca said, her voice steady, thank you for these 3 days. They were ours, Ruth added. No matter what comes next, no one can take that from us. A knock thundered on the door. Heavy, imperious, the sound of someone accustomed to having doors opened immediately. Elijah crossed to the door and put his hand on the latch. On the other side waited a world that would judge what had happened here. That would see sin where he saw survival. That would condemn where he had simply tried to keep two people alive. He thought of Anna one more time, thought of what she would tell him to do, and he heard her voice as clear as if she stood beside him. The truth, Eli. Always the truth, no matter the cost. He opened the door. Sister Margaret Thorne stood on his threshold like an avenging angel carved from ice, her eyes taking in the scene behind him in one sweeping glance. Two novices in states of undress, a mountain man with blood on his hands, a cabin that spoke of 3 days of intimacy. Her face remained impassive, but Elijah saw the judgment form behind her eyes, saw the conclusion she reached before a single word was spoken. This was not going to end well. Sister Margaret Thorne entered the cabin like winter itself, bringing with her an authority so absolute it seemed to lower the temperature. Behind her came two men, a priest whose weathered face spoke of years on the frontier, and a grizzled mountain guide whose eyes took in the scene with the practiced assessment of a man who had seen everything and judged little. The Mother Superior's gaze moved across the cabin in systematic inventory. Two novices, one still wrapped in blankets on the floor, the other standing despite an obvious leg injury. Both wore simple, cotton undergarments beneath the blankets, their religious habits hanging by the fire to dry. A single bed clearly slept in, medical supplies scattered across the table, blood on the floorboards. And in the center of it all, a tall mountain man with a scar bisecting his face and blood dried brown beneath his fingernails. She took in everything in perhaps 5 seconds. Her expression never changed, but something crystallized behind her eyes. Judgment swift and absolute. Rebecca, Ruth, her voice carried the weight of stone falling. Explain yourselves. Rebecca straightened despite her splinted leg. Pain flickered across her face, but she held her ground. Sister Margaret, we were caught in the storm. The wagon overturned. Mr. Stone rescued us from... I can see what you were caught in. Sister Margaret's words cut like a blade. The question is whether you participated willingly. The implication hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. Elijah felt something cold settle in his chest. He had saved their lives, spent 3 days keeping them alive. And this woman's first assumption was violation. Ma'am, his voice came out low and dangerous. You'll want to watch your words. Sister Margaret's eyes found his for the first time. What he saw there was not fear or even respect, but something closer to contempt. I don't speak to men of your type. The priest behind her cleared his throat. He was perhaps 38, with the kind of face that had seen too much suffering to rush to judgment. Sister Margaret, perhaps we should hear the full account before making accusations. The facts speak for themselves, Father Webb. But Sister Margaret moved closer, her eyes sharp on Ruth's bandaged head, on Rebecca's splinted leg. Clinical evidence that supported their story, even as her tone suggested she doubted everything. Rebecca told it simply. The storm, the wagon's overturn, Elijah's rescue, the medical treatment. 3 days of survival while the blizzard raged. Sister Margaret listened in silence, her face revealing nothing. When Rebecca finished, the Mother Superior approached Ruth and examined the head wound with surprising gentleness. Her fingers traced the neat stitches, noted the honey poultice, assessed the lack of infection. Who did this work? She asked. Mr. Stone, Ruth said, her voice still weak from the fever. Sister Margaret straightened. For a moment, something flickered in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, of skill that saved rather than harmed, but it passed, quickly replaced by the rigid certainty she wore like armor. The facts may be innocent, she said, turning back to face them all. But the situation is not. 2 days alone with a man, unchaperoned, in night clothes. Her eyes moved to the drying habits, to the blankets wrapped around both women. The appearance alone could destroy everything you've worked toward. Ruth struggled to sit up straighter. We were dying, sister. Modesty seemed less important than survival. Survival of the body at expense of the soul. Sister Margaret's voice hardened. You don't understand what you've risked, what people will say, what this means for your vocation. Elijah stepped forward. Every instinct told him to stay silent, to let them handle this. But the accusation in Sister Margaret's voice, the suggestion that he had somehow corrupted these women by saving their lives, ignited something he thought had died with Anna. They risked nothing, he said. I touched them only as a doctor touches patients. Nothing more happened. Sister Margaret turned to him with a smile that held no warmth. Nothing or nothing yet, Mr. Stone. The mountain guide Luther Hayes shifted uncomfortably by the door. Father Webb's face tightened, but Sister Margaret held Elijah's gaze without flinching, and what he saw there was not uncertainty, but absolute conviction. I know who you are, she said, her voice soft now and somehow more dangerous for it. Elijah went still. Luther recognized you yesterday when we found the wagon's trail. You're the trapper whose wife died in childbirth, the one who buried her, and the child then vanished into these mountains like a man running from something. Rebecca's sharp intake of breath told Elijah she hadn't known this detail. Ruth's eyes widened. He could feel their gazes on him, reassessing understanding, clicking into place. Sister Margaret continued relentless. A man who couldn't save his own family now plays savior to mine. How convenient, how very suspicious. Father Webb stepped forward. Sister, that's enough. Is it Father? Sister Margaret never took her eyes from Elijah. Look at them. Look at how they watch him. Look at their faces when they hear his tragedy. They're already halfway to falling for the wounded hero in his mountain retreat. Elijah forced himself to meet Rebecca's eyes, then Ruth's. What he saw there made his chest tight. Not pity exactly, but something worse, understanding, recognition. The kind of look that said they saw past his walls to the broken thing beneath. Sister Margaret saw it too. Her expression shifted to something approaching satisfaction. I thought so, she said. This rescue has compromised more than your safety, girls. It's compromised your vocation. That's not fair, Rebecca said, but her voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Tell me true, child. Can you look me in the eyes and say you feel nothing for this man? The silence that followed was answer enough. Rebecca's jaw worked, but no words came. Ruth looked down at her hands, and Elijah felt something in his chest crack wider, letting in light he hadn't asked for and didn't want. Sister Margaret nodded, as if a case had been proven. Father Webb, we need to speak. Outside. Luther, stay here. Make sure no one leaves. The priest and the Mother Superior stepped into the cold. Through the window, Elijah could see them in intense discussion. Sister Margaret's gesture sharp and emphatic. Father Webb's posture, one of reluctant agreement. Inside the cabin, silence stretched like wire pulled taut. Luther Hayes stood by the door, his weathered face neutral. He'd spent enough years in these mountains to know that judgment came easy and truth came hard. Finally, Ruth spoke. Is it true about your wife? Elijah didn't answer, didn't trust himself to speak without his voice breaking. We're sorry, Rebecca said softly. We didn't know. Nothing to know. Elijah's words came out flat. Happened. Can't unhappen. That's all. But it wasn't all. Ruth's intuitive gaze saw through the deflection. You blame yourself. Ruth, Rebecca warned. He does. I can see it. Ruth's fever-bright eyes held his. You think if you'd been there, been faster, been better, you could have saved them. So you came up here to die slowly instead of all at once. The words hit like physical blows. Elijah turned away his hands, gripping the edge of the table hard enough to make the wood creak. Every instinct screamed at him to shut this down, to rebuild the walls, to force these women out of his life before they could see any deeper. But Rebecca spoke before he could. Understand something about survivor's guilt, Mr. Stone. He looked up despite himself. Our parents were missionaries, she continued, killed by Sioux when we were 10. We survived because we hid in a root cellar while they died above us. We could hear everything, every scream, every plea, and we did nothing. Ruth's voice joined her sister's. We joined the convent because we thought maybe serving God would make up for our cowardice, for being alive when they weren't. That's not cowardice, Elijah said. You were children. And you were one man against childbirth complications no doctor could fix, Rebecca countered. But we tell ourselves the same lie, don't we? That we should have been more, done more, been enough to change what couldn't be changed. The truth of it settled over the cabin like snow. Three broken people, each carrying guilt that had no rational basis but felt as real as scars. Each one trying to survive by pretending not to feel anything at all. Outside, the conversation ended. Sister Margaret and Father Webb returned, their faces set in expressions that told Elijah the verdict was in. Rebecca, Ruth, Sister Margaret's voice carried finality. We're leaving within the hour. Father Webb will check your injuries. If you can travel, we go to the mission immediately. And if we can't, Rebecca asked, then we wait one more day, but no longer. Luther will stay here to ensure propriety. Father Webb moved to examine Ruth's head wound, his touch gentle and professional. He asked her questions about pain, checked her pupil to response, nodded approval at Elijah's stitch work. Clean sutures, he said. Proper infection management. You likely saved her life, Mr. Stone. He did, Ruth said firmly. Sister Margaret's expression didn't soften. Gratitude is natural. Conflating gratitude with other feelings is dangerous. We know the difference, Rebecca said, an edge creeping into her voice. You're novices? Sheltered? Innocent? You've never been alone with a man before this. How would you know what you're feeling is genuine versus simple proximity and rescue fantasy? It was a fair question clinically asked, but something about the way Sister Margaret said it, the assumption that Rebecca and Ruth were children, incapable of understanding their own hearts, made Elijah's hands curl into fists. Father Webb finished his examination. Ruth can travel. It's risky, but staying poses its own dangers. His eyes flicked to Elijah, and there was understanding there. This priest had seen enough of frontier life to know that hearts didn't follow rules of propriety. Then we leave at first light tomorrow, Sister Margaret decided. The storm has passed, enough for travel. We'll reach the mission in 2 days if we push hard. In 2 days, Ruth's voice cracked. But final vows are in 18 days. We're supposed to have time. You've had 10 years to prepare. Sister Margaret cut her off. And these past 3 days have shown me you need less time for preparation and more for securing your commitment before temptation grows stronger. The implication was clear. She was accelerating their vows, locking them into the religious life before whatever was growing between them and Elijah could take deeper root. Rebecca's face went pale. You can't do that. I can and I must. You'll take your final vows at the mission. 1 week from today, both of you, together as you've always wanted. The word together landed like a stone, because both twins knew what Sister Margaret meant. Together in the convent, separated from this cabin, this mountain, this man who had saved them and seen them, and somehow in 3 days made them question everything they thought they wanted. Elijah watched it happen, watched the light go out of their eyes, watched resignation settle over them like snow over graves. And something in him, something he thought had died 14 months ago, roared back to life with a fury that shocked him. No, the word came out before he could think. Everyone turned to stare at him. Sister Margaret's eyebrows rose. Excuse me. Elijah didn't have words for what he was feeling, didn't have language for the way his chest had gone tight watching these two women surrender to a future they didn't want. But he knew the look in their eyes, had seen it in the mirror every day since Anna died. The look of someone giving up. You're forcing them, he said. They don't want this, either of them. They went to your convent because they had nowhere else to go. They stayed because they had each other, but they're not called to it. Anyone with eyes can see that. Sister Margaret's face hardened to stone. And you would know their calling better than the church, better than me, who has guided them for 10 years. I know what it looks like when someone's living a life that's killing them from the inside, and I'm looking at it right now. Father Webb cleared his throat. Perhaps we should all take a moment to... But Sister Margaret was past diplomacy. She advanced on Elijah with the kind of righteous fury that had launched crusades and that burned heretics. You know nothing about these girls, she hissed. Nothing about sacrifice or devotion or the higher calling of service to God. You're a hermit who abandoned society when tragedy struck, a coward who hides in mountains rather than face his grief. And now you dare to judge their vocation. Each word was designed to wound. Each one found its mark. But Elijah stood his ground, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet and absolutely certain. I know they whispered last night about being afraid of final vows. I know Ruth told Rebecca she never wanted the religious life, but chose it to stay together. I know Rebecca admitted the same thing. And I know that forcing people into vows they don't want isn't serving God. It's serving your own need for control. Sister Margaret's face went white, then red. Her hand rose as if to strike him, then stopped trembling in the air between them. Father Webb stepped forward quickly. Sister, please. How dare you, she whispered. How dare you listen to private conversations and then presume to understand? I understand they're terrified, Elijah interrupted. I understand they've been too afraid to admit they don't want this life. And I understand that you're about to lock them into vows that will make them miserable for the next 50 years, because you can't stand the idea that someone might choose differently than you did. The last words hit like a slap. Sister Margaret's composure cracked visibly, her eyes going wide with something that looked like pain before the mask slammed back down. Get out, she said. This is no longer your concern. Sister Margaret, Father Webb tried. Get out, her voice cracked like a whip. Luther, escort Mr. Stone outside. The girls need to prepare for departure. Luther Hayes looked uncomfortable but moved toward Elijah. The mountain guide's eyes held apology. Come on, friend, nothing more to do here. Elijah looked past him to Rebecca and Ruth. Both women stared back, their faces showing a complicated tangle of emotions he couldn't parse. Fear, hope, desperation, resignation. Ruth's hand found Rebecca's. Their fingers intertwined with the automatic ease of a lifetime. And then Ruth did something that changed everything. She reached into her blanket and pulled out something small. The silver cross her mother had given her years ago, the one she'd worn hidden beneath her habit even as a novice. She held it out to Elijah. Keep this safe for me, she said. Sister Margaret moved to stop her. Ruth, no. But Ruth's eyes never left Elijah's face. I'll come back for it someday. The promise in those words was unmistakable. So was the plea. Keep this part of me. Remember me. Wait for me. Elijah's hand closed around the cross. The silver was warm from being held against Ruth's heart. Don't come back, he said, his voice rough. Forget me. Live your life. But even as he said it, his fingers tightened around the cross until the metal bit into his palm. Rebecca whispered something in French. Nous reviendrons. We will return. And Elijah, who had trapped in French-Canadian territory for years, answered in the same language before he could stop himself. Ne revenez pas. Oubliez-moi. Don't return. Forget me. But the way his voice broke on the words made them a lie. Luther guided him firmly toward the door. Elijah went because staying would only make things harder. But at the threshold, he turned back one last time. Rebecca and Ruth stood together, supporting each other, watching him with identical expressions of longing and loss. Sister Margaret stood between them and Elijah like a living wall, her face set in lines of absolute certainty. And Father Webb watched it all with eyes that understood more than he was saying. The door closed. The night that followed was the longest of Elijah's life. He slept in his lean-to, with the horses unable to bear the cabin that still smelled of honey poultices and fear and something else. Something that felt dangerously like hope. Luther joined him there, bringing coffee and a silence that was almost companionable. She's a hard woman, the guide said eventually. Elijah didn't ask who he meant. She's afraid. Of what? That they'll make different choices than she did, and live happier lives because of it. Luther considered this while drinking his coffee. You know her story? No. Andrew Thorne, Boston, 1843. She was engaged to him. Wealthy family wanted the marriage, but Margaret wanted God more, or thought she did. Went into the convent at 19. Andrew died at Gettysburg 20 years later, still carrying her picture. The information settled into place. Sister Margaret wasn't cruel. She was wounded. She had chosen duty over love and spent 33 years wondering if she'd made the right choice. Now 2 young women stood at the same crossroads, and she was determined to save them from making the opposite mistake, even if that mistake might actually be the right choice. They're leaving at dawn, Luther said. Sister Margaret's orders, pushing hard for the mission. I know. You going to let them go? Elijah looked at the silver cross in his hand. Ruth's warmth had faded from the metal. Now it just felt cold and accusatory. What choice do I have? Luther shrugged. None, I suppose. Unless you're willing to fight for them. They have vows to consider, a life planned out. I can't ask them to throw that away for a broken-down trapper who couldn't even save his own wife. Maybe they don't want you to ask. Maybe they want to choose for themselves. The words hit hard because they were true. Elijah had been so focused on his own unworthiness, his own fear of loss, that he hadn't considered what Rebecca and Ruth might actually want. They had whispered in the dark about choosing him, both of them, together. The impossibility of it should have made it easy to dismiss. But mountain living taught you that impossible just meant no one had done it yet. Get some sleep, Luther said, standing. Morning comes whether we're ready or not. He left Elijah alone with his thoughts and a silver cross that felt heavier than it should. Inside the cabin, lamplight glowed warm. Elijah could see shadows moving behind the oiled-skin window. Rebecca and Ruth preparing to leave. Sister Margaret standing guard over their souls. Father Webb caught between duty and conscience. Elijah put the cross on the leather cord with Anna's wedding ring. 2 pieces of metal, 2 women, 1 dead, 1 alive, and riding away in the morning. He should let them go, should let them take their vows and live their lives and forget the 3 days in a mountain cabin where something impossible had started to grow. Should, but the cross rested against his chest right over his heart, and he could still feel Ruth's warmth in the metal. Could still see Rebecca's fierce defense of his character. Could still hear them whispering in the dark about choosing him. Sleep didn't come. Elijah lay awake in the lean-to, listening to the horses breathe and the night wind move through the pines, and tried to convince himself that letting them go was the right thing to do. By the time dawn touched the peaks, he had failed completely. Morning came cold and clear. The storm had scrubbed the sky to a blue so intense it hurt to look at. Snow lay thick across the mountains, pristine and unmarked, except for the trail of smoke rising from Elijah's cabin. He stood outside watching Luther and Father Webb prepare the horses. Sister Margaret emerged from the cabin, her face set in lines of grim satisfaction. Behind her came Rebecca and Ruth, back in their habits and veils, looking like strangers. But their eyes, when they found Elijah, were anything but strange. Father Webb approached him while the others were occupied. The priest's face held a complicated expression that might have been sympathy or warning or both. Thank you for saving them, Mr. Stone. God's work, whether you intended it or not. Wasn't trying to do God's work, just trying to keep people alive. Sometimes that's the same thing. Father Webb glanced back at the twins and lowered his voice. Sister Margaret is harsh, but she's not wrong about one thing. They've developed feelings for you, both of them. I can see it. Elijah's jaw tightened. Doesn't matter. They're leaving. Does it matter to you? That's the question you should be asking. Before Elijah could answer, Sister Margaret called out, Father, we're ready. The twins mounted their horses with Luther's help. Rebecca sat straight despite her leg. Ruth's bandaged head was hidden beneath her veil. They looked like what they were, novices of the church returning to their proper place after an unfortunate detour. Except for their eyes. Their eyes told a different story. Sister Margaret mounted last, her posture as rigid as judgment itself. She looked at Elijah one final time, and what he saw in her face was not victory, but something sadder. The look of someone who had won a battle at the cost of her own humanity. Goodbye, Mr. Stone. Thank you for your service to these young women. I pray you find peace in your solitude. The words were formal, correct, absolutely hollow. Ruth's horse moved forward. Then Rebecca said they rode side by side, their shoulders touching even in the saddle. Neither looked back, but halfway across the clearing, Ruth's hand went to her chest where the cross had hung. Found nothing. Her shoulders shook once, and Elijah knew she was crying beneath the veil. Rebecca's hand found her sister's, held tight, and then they were gone, following Sister Margaret and Luther down the trail toward the mission and a life that would lock them away from everything they might have chosen for themselves. Father Webb lingered a moment. If you need anything, Mr. Stone, spiritual counsel or simply conversation, I'll be at the mission for 3 weeks. I won't need anything. Perhaps not. Father Webb's eyes were kind, but they might. He rode away, leaving Elijah alone in the clearing. The silence was absolute. No wind, no birds, just the weight of emptiness in a silver cross against his chest that felt like an accusation. Elijah turned back to his cabin. Inside, it looked exactly as it had 4 days ago. Same furniture, same books, same medical kit, but it felt different now, felt hollow, as if the presence of two women for 3 days had exposed just how alone he had been. He picked up Anna's wedding ring, still on the same cord as Ruth's cross. Two pieces of his heart metal made meaningful by love and loss. "I'm sorry," he said to the empty air, to Anna's memory, to his own weakness. "I'm sorry I couldn't let them go without feeling this." The cabin offered no answer. Just the ticking of his clock and the creak of settling logs and the knowledge that he had done the right thing by letting them ride away. The right thing. So why did it feel like the worst mistake of his life? 3 days passed in a haze of routine. Elijah ran his trap lines. Skinned beaver, tanned hides, ate food that tasted like ash, slept in a bed that felt too big and too empty and too much like giving up. On the fourth morning, he woke to the sound of hoofbeats. His hand found his rifle before his eyes fully opened. Mountain instinct honed by years of sleeping light in territory where death could approach on 4 legs or two. But the rider who appeared in his clearing was alone and familiar. Father Webb, his horse lathered from hard riding, his face urgent. Elijah was outside before the priest fully dismounted. "What happened?" Father Webb swung down, his movements stiff. "They ran, Rebecca and Ruth, sometime before dawn. Took their habits off, left them folded on their beds with a note." Elijah's heart, that traitorous organ that had tried so hard to stay dead, slammed against his ribs. What did the note say? 2 words: "Forgive us." "Where are they?" "That's what I'm here to ask you. Sister Margaret is searching the mission grounds. Luther is checking the trail back to town. But I thought," Father Webb's eyes held knowing, "I thought maybe they'd come here." Elijah turned toward the tree line, scanning. Nothing, just snow and shadow and the morning sun painting everything gold. Then movement. 2 figures emerged from the aspens, walking with purpose despite their injuries. They wore simple frontier dresses instead of habits, the kind kept at missions for settlers who arrived with nothing. Their hair, uncovered for the first time, caught the sunlight. Honey blonde and identical, falling past their shoulders in waves. Rebecca and Ruth Winters walking straight toward the cabin like it was the only sanctuary that mattered. Behind them, perhaps 200 yards back, Sister Margaret rode hard, shouting something lost to distance. Elijah looked at Father Webb. "What do I do?" The priest's smile was slight but genuine. "That depends. Do you love them?" "I don't know. I don't let myself know." "Then you'd better figure it out in the next 60 seconds, because Sister Margaret is going to demand you turn them over, and those 2 girls are walking toward you like you're the only salvation they'll ever need." The twins reached the clearing, stopped 20 feet from Elijah. Close enough to see the determination in their eyes. Close enough to see they weren't running from something but toward it. Sister Margaret's horse thundered into the clearing, foam flying from its mouth. She dismounted while the animal was still moving, her face crimson with fury and something that looked dangerously like desperation. "Get away from that man." Her voice cracked like a whip. "Now." Rebecca and Ruth moved to flank Elijah instead, stood on either side of him, their presence a statement more powerful than words. "No," Rebecca said. "Simple. Absolute." Sister Margaret's face went through a series of expressions. Shock, rage, disbelief. "What did you say?" "We're not going back," Ruth added, her voice quiet but immovable. "You don't have a choice. You're under my authority until final vows." Rebecca lifted her chin. "Which we're not taking." The words hung in the clear mountain air like smoke signals, like declarations of war, like the sound of chains breaking. Sister Margaret swayed slightly as if struck. When she spoke again, her voice was barely controlled. "You would throw away your vocation, your calling, 10 years of preparation for what for him?" She pointed at Elijah like he was contamination made flesh. Rebecca stepped forward. "Not for him, for ourselves." "We were never called to the convent, sister," Ruth said, her voice gaining strength. "We went there because we were 10 years old and terrified and alone. We stayed because it was safe, because we could be together. But it was never what God wanted for us." Sister Margaret's laugh was sharp and bitter. "And you know God's will better than the church, better than me, who has guided you since you were children." "We know our own harm," Rebecca said. and our hearts are telling us this is right. The Mother Superior turned to Elijah, her eyes blazing with something that looked like accusation and envy mixed in equal measure. You did this. You seduced them with your mountain hermit tragedy, your wounded soul, your careful hands. You gave them ideas about freedom and choice and love outside God's plan. Elijah met her gaze steadily. I did nothing but save their lives. You gave them hope. Sister Margaret's composure cracked completely. You showed them what it could be like to be seen, to be valued, to be wanted for who they are instead of what they represent. And now they think they can just walk away from 10 years of devotion for a fairy tale that will end in heartbreak. Better heartbreak than a lifetime of regret, Rebecca said quietly. Sister Margaret spun toward her, and for a moment Elijah thought the older woman might strike the younger. But instead, she said something that hit harder than any blow. You think you know regret, your children. You know nothing about waking up at 52 years old and wondering if the life you chose was actually the life you wanted, or just the life you were too afraid to refuse. The confession hung raw and bleeding between them. Father Webb made a small sound of sympathy. Even Rebecca and Ruth looked shaken. But Rebecca recovered first, her voice gentle now. Then why would you want that for us? Why would you push us toward the same choice that's left you with questions? Because the alternative is worse. Sister Margaret's voice broke. The alternative is choosing love and losing it, choosing a man and watching him die, building a life together and having it ripped away. At least in the convent, you are protected from that kind of pain. We're also protected from that kind of joy, Ruth said softly. Sister Margaret's face crumpled. For just a moment, the iron mask fell away and revealed the woman beneath. Lost, lonely, horrified that she had wasted her entire life on a vow that had given her purpose but stolen her happiness. Then the mask slammed back. You're making a mistake. Maybe, Rebecca acknowledged, but it's our mistake to make. I won't bless this. I won't condone it. When it falls apart, when he abandons you or dies and leaves you alone, don't come crawling back to the church for comfort. The bitterness in her voice was a living thing. Father Webb stepped forward, his hand raised in a gesture that might have been blessing or plea. Sister Margaret, there might be another way. A solution that satisfies both God and conscience. Everyone turned to look at him. The priest's face held something between hope and trepidation, as if he was about to propose something that could either save them all or condemn him. Marriage, Father Webb said, to Mr. Stone, both of them. The silence that followed was absolute. Sister Margaret found her voice first. Impossible, illegal, immoral. Actually, none of those things. Father Webb's voice carried the calm authority of someone who had thought this through. Frontier law allows for common law marriage by declaration before witnesses, and biblical precedent exists. Jacob married Rachel and Leah, sisters. That was the Old Testament, written by God nonetheless. I'm not saying the church will approve sister, but I can witness a legal marriage contract that protects these women under civil law and satisfies the requirements of frontier society. Elijah's mind reeled. Marriage to both of them. The priest was suggesting something that couldn't work by any conventional measure. But then nothing about the situation was conventional. Sister Margaret's laugh was harsh. You would violate church teaching for this. For them. I would honor their choice while keeping them within the protection of marriage law. Yes, the church may never recognize it, but God might. Father Webb turned to Elijah. If you care for them, both of them, make them an honest offer. Marriage, protection, a life together, not perfect perhaps, not accepted by everyone, but real. Elijah looked at Rebecca and Ruth, saw them watching him with identical expressions of hope and fear mixed together. These two women who had appeared out of a storm, who had whispered in the dark about choosing him, who stood here now having given up everything they knew, waiting for him to decide their fate. You want this? His voice came out rough. Both of you to marry me. Yes, Rebecca said. Yes, Ruth echoed. You don't even know me. Rebecca's smile was slight but genuine. We know you saved us when you could have walked away. We know you're gentle when you need to be, and hard when you must be, Ruth added. We know you are grieving and broken and think you don't deserve love, Rebecca continued. But we know you do deserve it, Ruth finished, and we want to give it to you, both of us. The last two words hung in the air. Both of us, not one or the other, not a choice between them, but a joining of three souls into something that defied convention and tradition and everything Elijah thought he knew about how life was supposed to work. He looked at Father Webb. This is insane. Probably, the priest agreed, but so is everything else about this situation. Sometimes God works in insane ways. Elijah turned back to Sister Margaret, saw the defeat in her eyes, saw her recognizing that she had already lost this battle, perhaps had lost it the moment Rebecca and Ruth walked out of the mission before dawn. "You'll fight this," he said. Sister Margaret's laugh was broken. "Fight it, I can't stop it. You're right about everything, Mr. Stone. I'm bitter because I chose duty over love, and I've regretted it every day since. I'm angry because these girls are brave enough to choose differently. And I'm terrified that they'll be happy because if they are, then I wasted 33 years on a vow that gave me nothing but loneliness." The confession was so raw, so honest that even Elijah felt the impact. This woman wasn't his enemy. She was just someone who had made different choices and carried the weight of them every day. Sister Margaret moved to her horse, mounted with movements that spoke of exhaustion beyond the physical. She looked at Rebecca and Ruth one last time, and her face held something that might have been benediction or curse or simply goodbye. "You've chosen your path. I pray it leads somewhere better than mine did." She turned the horse. "But when you fail, when the dream becomes reality, and reality becomes hard, don't expect me to welcome you back." She rode away without looking back. Her posture was still rigid, still controlled. But Elijah thought he saw her shoulders shake once, as if she were crying beneath the iron composure. Father Webb let out a long breath. "Well, that went better than expected." "Better," Elijah's voice held disbelief. "She could have tried to physically drag them back. The fact that she left means some part of her recognizes their right to choose." The priest turned to the twins. "Are you absolutely certain about this? Once vows are spoken, there's no taking them back." Rebecca and Ruth looked at each other. One of their wordless conversations flowed between them. Then they turned back to Father Webb in perfect synchronization. "We're certain," they said together. The priest nodded. "Then I'll need to prepare. Marriage contracts, witnesses, proper documentation. Give me 3 days. Come to the mission on Saturday. I'll perform the ceremony there." "Sister Margaret," Ruth started, "will be gone by then. She's leaving for St. Louis tomorrow morning. I'll stay behind to complete the mission setup." Father Webb's smile was gentle. "And to marry 3 people who probably shouldn't work, but somehow do." He mounted his horse, then paused. "Mr. Stone, a word of advice. The next 3 days, use them wisely. Talk to each other. Make sure this isn't just desperation or gratitude or rescue fantasy. Make sure it's real. Because marriage is hard enough when it's conventional. What you're attempting will require more honesty and commitment than most people can manage." "We know," Elijah said. "Do you? Because I think you're all still figuring out what this means. So figure it out before Saturday. Make sure you want what you're choosing." Father Webb rode away, leaving Elijah alone in the clearing with Rebecca and Ruth Winters. The silence stretched. 3 people who had decided to attempt the impossible, now confronted with the reality of what that meant. Elijah turned to face them, saw the hope in their eyes, saw the fear underneath it, saw 2 young women who had given up everything they knew for the possibility of something they barely understood. "Come inside," he said. "We need to talk." As they followed him into the cabin, as the door closed behind them, and the mountain silence settled once more, the Elijah felt the weight of Ruth's cross against his chest. 2 women, 1 man, 3 souls about to attempt something that had no map, no guide, no promise of success. Just faith that sometimes the right thing looked wrong until you had the courage to try it. The cabin door closed, and for the first time in 14 months, Elijah let himself imagine a future that held more than just survival. Inside the cabin, the 3 of them stood in a triangle of uncertainty. Elijah by the fire, his hands restless without work to occupy them. Rebecca near the table, her weight favoring her good leg. Ruth by the window, her fingers unconsciously touching the bandage beneath her hair. For a long moment, no one spoke. The magnitude of what they were about to attempt settled over them like snow, beautiful and suffocating in equal measure. Elijah broke first. He turned away, his shoulders tight with tension that had nothing to do with the cold. This is a mistake. Why? Rebecca's voice carried the analytical edge that was purely hers. Because I'll fail you. The words came out raw. I failed Anna. I'll fail you too. Ruth moved closer but didn't touch him. You didn't fail Anna. Childbirth is dangerous. It wasn't your fault. I was too late. The explosion of emotion shook the cabin walls. Elijah's fists clenched so hard his knuckles went white. I was out helping a neighbor with calving, and I came home, and she was dying, and our daughter was already dead, and I didn't. She died in my arms, asking me to save her, and I couldn't. The confession tore out of him like a wound opening. 14 months of silence, of grief compressed into rage at himself, of guilt that had calcified into the certainty that he destroyed everything he touched. He broke down completely. Not the silent tears of a man trying to maintain control, but the full-body sobs of someone who had never properly grieved. His knees hit the floor. His hands covered his face. And the sound that came from him was the sound of a heart-breaking all over again. Rebecca and Ruth didn't rush to him. They gave him space for the storm to pass, their own eyes wet with tears. They had learned something about grief in the years since their parents died. That sometimes the kindest thing you could do was simply witness someone else's pain without trying to fix it. When the worst had passed, when Elijah's breathing slowed to something approaching normal, Ruth spoke softly. We're not asking you to save us, Elijah. We're asking you to let us save you. Rebecca knelt beside him, her splinted leg making the movement awkward. Love isn't about never failing. It's about staying even when you do. Elijah looked up at them through red-rimmed eyes. I don't know how to do this. Be with one woman, let alone two. Neither do we, Rebecca admitted, but we'll figure it out. Together. He searched their faces, looking for doubt or second thoughts, or the kind of fear that would give him permission to send them away. Found nothing but certainty. Why? His voice was hoarse from crying. Why both of you? Why not just one? The twins exchanged one of their looks. Rebecca answered first. Because we're not two separate people who happen to look alike. We're halves of the same soul. We've been together since before we were born. We can't be separated. Not anymore. When you love one of us, you have to love both, Ruth continued. It's not possible otherwise. We're a pair, a set. Trying to split us would be like trying to split your own heart in half and function with only one piece. Rebecca's hand found Ruth's. Their fingers intertwined with the automatic ease of a lifetime. If you can't accept that we understand, we'll leave, but we won't be separated. Not for the church, not for society's approval, not for anything. Elijah looked at their joined hands, thought about Anna, who used to talk about having a big family, lots of children running through a house full of noise and Kay and life. She had wanted love that overflowed, that spilled out into the world and made it better. She had gotten none of that, just him and silence, and a grave that held her dreams along with her body. Anna used to talk about having a house full of love, he said quietly. Lots of children, lots of noise. She wanted everything to be alive and growing and messy. He looked up at them. She got silence instead. Just me shutting down, shutting out, shutting everything away. Ruth's hand reached out, not touching, but close. Maybe she'd want you to try again. Try for the life she dreamed of. Maybe she sent us to you, Rebecca added, to give you a second chance at the family she wanted. The thought should have felt like betrayal. Instead, it felt like permission, like Anna's voice in his memory saying what she had always said, don't waste your life on regret, Eli. Live enough for both of us. Elijah stood slowly, looked between them, saw two women who had walked away from everything they knew based on 3 days of whispered hope and a conviction that this was right. I'll try, he said, but I can't promise I'll be good at this. Ruth's smile was like sunrise. We'll teach you. The next 2 days unfolded with a strange domesticity that felt both natural and surreal. Rebecca and Ruth stayed in the cabin, propriety be damned. There was nowhere else for them to go, and all three of them knew that what mattered now wasn't appearance but truth. They learned each other in the small ways. Rebecca organized Elijah's supplies with a strategic mind that saw inefficiencies he'd never noticed. Ruth sketched the view from the window in charcoal, capturing the mountains with an artist's eye. Elijah taught them to read weather signs to understand the language the wilderness spoke for those who knew how to listen. At night they slept separately. Elijah in his corner, the twins by the fire. But the conversations that happened in the dark grew deeper, more honest. "What scares you most?" Ruth asked on the second night. Elijah didn't pretend to misunderstand. "That I'll love you both and lose you both. That history repeats. That I'm not meant to have this kind of happiness." Silence. Then Rebecca's voice, thoughtful in the darkness. "What scares me is that we're being selfish. That we're choosing what we want instead of what we should want. That God will punish us for breaking our vows." "We never took final vows," Ruth reminded her. "But we intended to. We promised. Does that count for nothing?" More silence. Elijah could hear them breathing in perfect synchronization the way they did everything. "I think God cares more about truth than promises," he said finally. "You would have been miserable in that convent, both of you. Living a lie doesn't honor God. It just wastes the life he gave you." "Is that what you believe?" Rebecca asked. "Or what you hope?" "Both." Ruth's soft laugh carried warmth. An honest answer. "I'll take it." The conversation drifted into silence. Elijah lay awake long after the twins slept, listening to their breathing and wondering how three broken people were supposed to make one whole life. Saturday dawned clear and cold. They rode to the mission in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Elijah had shaved, trimmed his hair, put on his one good shirt that wasn't buckskin or stained with blood. The twins wore the simple dresses they'd borrowed, their hair braided and uncovered. They looked like frontier women heading to town, not novices heading to vows. The mission was quiet when they arrived. Sister Margaret had indeed left her absence a presence all its own. Father Webb met them at the chapel door, his face grave but not unkind. "Luther agreed to witness," he said, "and I've prepared the documents. Civil marriage contract recognized under territorial law. The church won't acknowledge it, but the state will." "That's enough," Elijah said. They gathered in the small chapel. Luther Hayes stood to one side, his weathered face neutral, but his eyes kind. Father Webb took his place before them, Bible in hand, and for a moment simply looked at the three people who were about to attempt something most would call impossible. "Before we begin," the priest said, "I need each of you to understand what you're doing. Marriage is a covenant. It requires honesty, sacrifice, and commitment. What you're attempting requires all that and more. It requires you to abandon conventional expectations, to create your own rules, to face judgment from a world that won't understand." He looked at Elijah. "You'll be called immoral, sinful, a man who corrupted innocence." To Rebecca and Ruth, "You'll be called fallen women, harlots, failures who couldn't keep their vows." Back to all three. "Can you live with that judgment? Can you build a life knowing most people will never approve?" "Yes," they said together. Father Webb nodded. "Then let's begin." The ceremony was simple. No flowers, no music, no gathering of family and friends. Just four people in a frontier chapel and vows that would bind them in ways the church wouldn't recognize, but God might. Father Webb didn't use the traditional liturgy. Instead, he asked them to speak their own truth. Elijah went first. His hands were steady despite the enormity of what he was doing. He looked at Rebecca. "I vow to respect your mind, to never ask you to make yourself smaller, to let you lead when you're better suited. And I promise to protect your independence even as I promise to be yours." Rebecca's eyes shone. "I vow to challenge you when you need it, to stand beside you in hardship, to see your scars and love them as proof you survived. And I vow to share you with my sister and never let jealousy poison what we're building." Elijah turned to Ruth. "I vow to believe in your visions even when they don't make sense, to treasure your gentleness and never mistake it for weakness. And I vow to keep you safe in a world that would crush soft things." Ruth's voice shook, but it held. "I vow to bring light to your darkness, to remind you that loving again isn't betrayal, to hold you when the ghosts come. And I vow to love my sister first, last, always, and love you between us without measure." Then the twins turned to each other, and Elijah saw something that took his breath away. They were crying, both of them, but the tears were joy. Rebecca took Ruth's hands. "You're my other half, my mirror, my home. I vow that loving him won't mean loving you less." Ruth squeezed tight. "You're my courage, my strength, my anchor. I though vow the same. Together they turned back to Elijah. We are one heart and two bodies, now joined to a third. Elijah pulled out Anna's ring. The gold caught the light streaming through the chapel window. This was my first wife's. I can't give it to just one of you. That wouldn't be right. Then we'll share it, Ruth said. Like we share everything else, Rebecca added. Elijah placed the ring on Rebecca's finger. Wear it today. Ruth wears it tomorrow. Trade off. So you both have it and neither owns it. Rebecca touched the gold band with reverence, understanding what it meant that he could give this to them, that he was choosing to honor his past while embracing his future. Father Webb spoke the final words. What God has joined, let no one separate. And what God has joined here is not two but three. May he bless this unusual union and grant you more happiness than the world thinks you deserve. It was done. Three people married in a way that shouldn't work, but felt more right than anything Elijah had experienced since Anna's death. Luther stepped forward, signed into the witness line with a steady hand. Congratulations. Now come on, let's get you home before anyone asks questions I don't want to answer. They rode back to the cabin as husband and wives, the reality of it settling over them with each mile. When they crested the final ridge and saw Elijah's cabin in the valley below, Rebecca reached out and took his hand. Ruth took the other, and Elijah, who had spent 14 months believing he would die alone, felt something in his chest that might have been hope or terror, or simply the recognition that life had given him another chance. He was going to take it. The first month was a dance of learning. They discovered rhythms that worked, routines that made sense for three people learning to be a family. Rebecca took over planning and accounts, her strategic mind seeing ways to make the cabin more efficient. Ruth brought beauty to the space, arranging things in ways that pleased the eye while maintaining function. Elijah taught them mountain skills, showing them how to read sign and set traps and survive in country that killed the unprepared. The sleeping arrangement evolved naturally. Elijah built a larger bed, his woodworking skills creating something sturdy and generous. Rebecca chose the left side strategic positioning that let her see both Elijah and the door. Ruth took the right near the window where starlight could reach her. Elijah in the middle, protective, even in sleep. Their intimate life developed with surprising ease. There was no jealousy, no competition. When Elijah was with Rebecca, Ruth gave them space and privacy. When he was with Ruth, Rebecca did the same. And sometimes, though, never in ways that crossed certain lines, all three would simply be together. Talking, holding, finding comfort and closeness. But there were challenges. 2 weeks in, Rebecca and Ruth had their first real fight since childhood. Something about meal planning that escalated into deeper territory, touching on fears and insecurities neither had voiced. Elijah wisely stayed out of it, letting them work through it themselves. They did, and emerged stronger for it. 3 weeks in, Elijah had a nightmare. Anna's death replayed in vivid detail. He woke screaming, his hands grasping for her, trying to stop bleeding that existed only in memory. Both women held him until dawn, didn't ask him to explain, didn't try to fix it, just held him through the storm of grief that still ambushed him sometimes. 4 weeks in, Ruth caught a cold. Just a simple winter illness, nothing serious. But Elijah's reaction was pure panic. He checked her temperature every hour, made her stay in bed, prepared every remedy he knew. Rebecca talked him down gently. She's not Anna. This isn't childbirth. She'll be fine. Ruth was fine in 3 days, but the fear in Elijah's eyes during those 3 days showed how deeply the wound from losing Anna still ran. Yet there were moments of unexpected beauty. Morning hunts where Elijah taught them to track deer, Ruth sketching the prints while Rebecca memorized patterns. Evenings skinning beavers together, Rebecca mastering the technique with competitive precision, while Ruth laughed at her own failures. Nights reading Shakespeare aloud while firelight painted them all in shades of amber. One morning, Elijah woke before them, Rebecca on his left, honey blonde hair spread across the pillow. Ruth on his right, curled into his shoulder with one hand resting over his heart. The thought came unbidden. This is what healing feels like. He let himself believe it, just for a moment. Let himself imagine that maybe he could have this, that maybe he wouldn't destroy it, that maybe God was giving instead of taking for once. Then Ruth stirred, her eyes opening. She smiled at him with such pure joy that his chest ached. "Good morning," she whispered. "Morning." Rebecca woke stretched like a cat, grinned at both of them. "I'm starving. Who's making breakfast?" "Your turn," Ruth said. "I made it yesterday." "No, I did." They were still arguing playfully when Elijah got up to start the coffee. He listened to them bicker and laugh and negotiate and felt something he hadn't felt in over a year. Happy. 3 months into their marriage, Ruth made an announcement that turned Elijah's world inside out. "I'm with child." The words hit him like a physical blow. The coffee cup in his hand shattered on the floor, ceramic and liquid spreading across the boards. But Elijah didn't notice. Couldn't notice because all he could see was Anna dying. His daughter born silent and blue. Blood that wouldn't stop no matter what he did. He walked out of the cabin without his coat, without his hat, just walked into the February cold and kept walking until he couldn't breathe. Rebecca found him an hour later, hypothermic and shaking, sitting against a tree with snow piling up around him. "Come inside." Her voice was firm. "I can't do this again." His teeth chattered. "I can't watch another woman die in childbirth. I can't." "You won't." Rebecca's fierceness cut through his panic. "Because this time you have me. I'll help. We'll get her to a doctor. We'll do everything right. I did everything right with Anna. And sometimes people die anyway, but sometimes they don't. Ruth is strong. I'm here to help. And you're not alone this time." She got him back to the cabin by force of will. Inside, Ruth waited, her face white with fear that he would leave her. "I'm sorry," her voice broke. "I know you're scared." Elijah knelt before her, took her hands in his. "I'm terrified, but I'm staying. I'm here. We'll face this together." Ruth's sob was relief and fear mixed. "Promise?" "Promise." "Well." Rebecca knelt beside them both. "We do this carefully, no risks. At 8 months, we go to Lander. Find a real doctor. Stay there until the baby comes." "Agreed," Ruth whispered. "I'll do whatever keeps this baby safe," Elijah said. They held each other in the firelight, three people facing the thing that had destroyed Elijah once before. But this time he wasn't alone. This time he had help. This time, maybe, just maybe, it would be different. A week later, Rebecca made her own announcement. "I'm pregnant too." The silence that followed was absolute. Elijah stared at her, his mind refusing to process the information. "Both of you," his voice came out strangled. Rebecca and Ruth looked at each other, started laughing. Not manic or hysterical, but genuine amusement at the absurdity of it. "We've always done everything together," Ruth managed between giggles. "Why would pregnancy be different?" Rebecca wiped her eyes. Elijah sat down hard on the nearest chair, put his head in his hands. "Two babies, at the same time." "Well, probably a month apart," Rebecca said, her analytical mind working even through laughter. "But yes, essentially." Elijah ran his hands through his hair, looked at them, saw them watching him with matching expressions of hope and worry. "I need to build a bigger cabin," he said. And somehow, impossibly, he started laughing too. August 1877, the town of Lander, Wyoming Territory. They had been here for 6 weeks, living in a boarding house that charged too much and asked too many questions. But it had a real doctor, and that was worth any price. Ruth went into labor first. Elijah paced outside the room, every muscle in his body tight with the fear he couldn't control. Dr. Jameson had examined Ruth that morning, declared everything normal, but normal didn't mean safe. Normal didn't guarantee anything. Dr. Jameson was not the kindly Dr. Morrison who had trained Elijah. This man was all business, efficient, and emotionless. But he was competent, and that was what mattered. Through the door, he could hear Ruth's cries, could hear Rebecca coaching her through breathing, could hear the doctor's calm instructions, could hear Anna's voice in his memory begging him to save their daughter. Dr. Jameson appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Stone, your wife is asking for you." "I can't." Elijah's voice shook. "Last time I watched this, she died. I can't." Rebecca appeared behind the doctor, her face calm despite her own advanced pregnancy. "This isn't last time, and Ruth needs you, so get in here." The command in her voice broke through his paralysis. Elijah entered the room on legs that barely held him. Ruth lay in the bed mid-contraction, sweating and scared. But when she saw him, her face transformed. "Don't leave, please don't leave." Elijah took her hand, let her squeeze until bones ground together. I'm here. I'm staying. The labor lasted 14 hours. Difficult, but not dangerous. Throughout it all, Elijah held Ruth's hand while Rebecca coached and the doctor worked with professional competence. There were moments of terror, when Ruth's strength flagged and she said she couldn't do more, when the doctor's face tightened with concern, when Elijah felt certain that history was repeating and he was about to lose another wife, another child. But then the baby emerged, small and wrinkled and absolutely silent. Elijah's heart stopped. Dr. Jameson worked quickly, clearing the infant's airways, stimulating breath. The seconds stretched into eternities. Ruth's hand crushed Elijah's. Rebecca's face was white. Then the baby wailed, angry and loud and absolutely perfectly alive. Healthy boy, the doctor announced. Elijah collapsed into the nearest chair and sobbed. Not from grief this time, but from overwhelming relief. Ruth had survived. The baby had survived. History had not repeated. Ruth, exhausted but radiant, reached for him. We did it. You did it, Elijah managed through tears. They named him Thomas Elijah Stone, after no one in particular, just a good strong name for a boy who had fought his way into the world. 3 weeks later, it was Rebecca's turn. Her labor was faster, 8 hours instead of 14. But more intense, the contractions coming hard and fast. I'm doing this faster than Ruth, aren't I? Rebecca managed between pains, her competitive nature showing even now. Ruth, holding baby Thomas, laughed. It's not a race. Everything's a race, Rebecca gasped. Elijah found himself almost smiling despite the fear that still gripped him. Both of you are insane. This time when the baby emerged, she cried immediately, strong lungs announcing her arrival. Healthy girl, Dr. Jameson said, handing the infant to Rebecca. Elijah held his daughter for the first time since the one who had died. The weight of her in his arms, the warmth of new life, the way her tiny hand gripped his finger, all of it crashed over him like a wave. Anna Rebecca Stone, he whispered, after both his wives, honoring the past while embracing the present. Rebecca, crying, reached for his hand. You're honoring her, your first wife. She'd want this, Elijah said, his voice rough with emotion. Want me to be happy, to have the family she dreamed of. That night in the boarding house room, Elijah sat in a chair with Anna Rebecca sleeping in his arms. Thomas slept in Rebecca's arms. Ruth recovered in bed, her eyes watching them all with contentment. Elijah looked around the room, at his wives, at his children, at the family that shouldn't exist but did. I have a family again, he said, wonder in his voice. You always had us, Ruth reminded him gently. I know, but now it feels real. Rebecca smiled. It is real, and it's perfect. The years that followed were not easy, but they were full. Thomas and Anna grew up knowing they had two mothers who loved them equally and a father who would move mountains for them. The cabin expanded room by room as Elijah's trapping prospered and the family grew. Society never fully accepted them. There were whispers in town judgment from those who saw sin where the Stone family saw love. But they had each other, and that was enough. When Thomas was 7, he came home crying from school. Papa, why do we have two mothers when everyone else has one? Elijah knelt to his son's level. Because we're lucky. But they said it's bad, that we're sinners. Rebecca knelt beside Elijah. Thomas, look at me. Do you feel loved? Yes. Ruth joined him on. Do you feel safe? Yes. Elijah pulled his son close. Then we're doing it right, and what other people think doesn't matter. The boy grew up strong and certain, knowing love came in forms the world didn't always understand, but God approved of anyway. Christmas Eve, 1918. Samuel sat at his grandfather's feet, the fire burning low, snow falling soft over the Wind River Valley. The story Elijah had told took shape in the young man's mind, like a photograph developing. So Thomas is my father, Samuel said slowly, piecing it together. Born to Ruth, and Anna, my aunt, born to Rebecca. Yes, Elijah's 70-year-old face showed the weight of memory. Half-siblings born 3 weeks apart to two mothers who loved each other and loved me in ways I still don't fully understand. How did it work? Growing up like that, Elijah smiled, the expression softening the scars. Remarkably well. Rebecca and Ruth raised the children together. No favorites, no jealousy. Thomas and Anna grew up thinking it was normal to have two mothers. When did they find out it wasn't? The smile faded. School, age 7, like I said. Thomas came home devastated. But we taught him that different doesn't mean wrong. That love is love, regardless of how many people share it. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then, when did they die, Grandmother Rebecca and Grandmother Ruth? Pain crossed Elijah's face. Rebecca in 1910. Influenza swept through that winter. She fought hard, but he trailed off. And Ruth? 6 months later, the doctor said it was her heart, but I think she just couldn't live without her twin. They were together from before birth. Being separated even by death was too much. Elijah stood slowly, moved to the mantel, took down a rubbing of a headstone. They're buried together. Same grave, same stone. Samuel read the inscription, Rebecca and Ruth Stone, 1854 to 1910/1854 to 1911. Beloved wives of Elijah, beloved mothers of Thomas and Anna. 2 hearts, 1 soul. And you've been alone since. Not alone, well. Elijah's voice was firm. I have Thomas, Anna, their children, you. I have memories. I have 34 years of love that most men don't get in a lifetime. Don't you wish you'd had more time? Every single day, but I don't regret a moment I had with them. Elijah turned to face his grandson, which brings me to why I told you this now before you shipped to France. Samuel waited. You're going to war. You might not come back. And before you go, you need to know this. Elijah moved to the window, gestured at the mountains bathed in moonlight. Those mountains don't care about rules. They don't care about what society says is proper. They care about what works, what survives. Rebecca and Ruth shouldn't have worked by every conventional measure, but they did, because the love was real, the commitment was real, the family was real. He turned back to Samuel. If you find love in any form it comes, don't let rules stop you from grabbing it, because love is the only thing that survives us. What if I don't come back from France? Elijah gripped his grandson's shoulder. Then you die knowing you lived fully. That's all any of us can hope for. He pulled something from his pocket, the silver cross Ruth had given him 42 years ago, still on the same leather cord, worn smooth by decades against his chest. She gave this to me the day we met. Said she'd come back for it someday. She never took it back. Said I needed it more. He pressed it into Samuel's hand. Now I'm giving it to you. Grandpa, I can't. You can and you will. When you're scared in those trenches, you hold this and remember, you come from love. You are love, and that's worth fighting for. Worth coming home for. Samuel's fingers closed around the cross, felt the warmth of his grandfather's hand, the weight of generations. I'll come back, he promised. See that you do. New Year's Day, 1919. Elijah stood on the porch and watched the wagon take Samuel to the train station. His grandson looked back, once raised a hand in farewell. Elijah raised his own hand, held it until the wagon disappeared around the bend. Then he was alone again. But this time the solitude felt different. Not like isolation, but like peace. He walked to the graves on the hillside. Rebecca and Ruth's shared stone stood beneath a blanket of snow. He had built a bench there years ago, a place to sit and talk to them when the loneliness got too heavy. Sent the boy off today, he said, settling onto the cold wood. He's scared. I gave him Ruth's cross. Hope that's okay. The wind moved through the pines, a sound that could have been whispers if you wanted to hear it that way. I miss you both, every day, but you gave me something I can never repay. Elijah's voice was steady despite the tears on his face. You taught me that love doesn't divide, it multiplies. We had Thomas and Anna, they had children. Those children will have children. Our love echoes forward through generations. That's immortality, not the grave, the love we leave behind. He stood touched, both names carved into stone. Thank you for choosing me, for saving me, for giving me a family when I thought that chapter was closed forever. Back at the cabin, he pulled out the journal Rebecca had insisted he keep. Write it down, she had said years ago. So the children remember, so they know where they came from. He opened to a fresh page and began to write, My name is Elijah Stone. This is the story of how 2 women saved me from myself and how we built a family that shouldn't have worked but did. This is for my grandchildren and their children, so they'll know where they came from. So they'll know that love, real love, makes its own rules. The lamp burned low. The fire crackled. Outside, snow fell soft and steady, and inside, an old man wrote the truth of his life for those who would come after. Spring came late to the mountains that year, but when it did, it came with fury. Flowers erupting from snow, creeks running wild with melt, life asserting itself against winter's death grip. Elijah Stone died in his sleep on a warm April night, 3 months after sending Samuel to war. He was 71 years old. His heart simply stopped, worn out from a lifetime of loving hard and losing harder and somehow finding the courage to love again anyway. They found him in the morning lying in the bed he had built for three, a slight smile on his weathered face. In his hand, clutched tight even in death, was Anna's wedding ring, the one Rebecca and Ruth had shared for 34 years. They buried him between them, three graves side by side on the hillside overlooking the valley. Thomas and Anna arranged it, understanding, without being told, that this was how it needed to be. The new headstone was simple. The epilogue came decades later, long after the last person who remembered them firsthand had passed. Samuel Hayes returned from France in 1919, the silver cross still around his neck. He married, had children, told them the story his grandfather had told him. Those children told their children, and their children told theirs. By the 1960s, when Samuel was an old man himself, the story of Elijah Stone and his two wives had become family legend. Some versions were romanticized. Some were sanitized for those too young or too conventional to handle the truth. But Samuel always told it straight. People asked me how it worked, he would say, sitting in his chair much as his grandfather had sat in his. Two women married to one man. And I tell them what Grandpa Elijah told me: love doesn't follow rules, it makes them. He loved them both, completely, equally, every day for 34 years. And when they died, he didn't remarry, didn't look for a replacement, because you can't replace what was perfect. They built something that shouldn't have been possible. And it worked because they were brave enough to try from it, honest enough to make their own rules, and loving enough to put each other first. The graves on the hillside became a place of pilgrimage for the family. Multiple generations would visit, leaving flowers on all three markers. Mothers would bring daughters. Fathers would bring sons, and they would tell the story. The story of a mountain man who thought he was done with love and two women who proved him wrong. The story of a family built on the ashes of grief and the foundation of courage. The story of three people who looked at society's rules and said politely but firmly, "No, thank you. We'll make our own way." And they did. The mountains endured as they always had. Snow fell in winter, melted in spring. Life continued its eternal cycle. But on that hillside, beneath three simple stones, rested proof that love was stronger than convention. That family was defined by commitment, not tradition. That sometimes the bravest thing you could do was choose happiness, even when the world said it was wrong. The wind moved through the pines. The creek sang its endless song. And if you listened very carefully in the quiet moments between, you could almost hear three voices, laughing, talking, loving, together as they had always meant to be.